It was a regular morning in the bustling downtown office of a mid-sized marketing agency. The clatter of keyboards, the hum of printers, and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. Among the sea of faces in the office was a hard-working employee whose dedication and passion for his job made him stand out. Known for his innovative ideas and strong work ethic, he had quickly become a favorite among his peers. But his boss, a man who seemed to carry the weight of authority as if it were a shield, never saw eye to eye with him. Their relationship was cordial at best, but tension lingered beneath the surface. For weeks, subtle signs of something brewing had been evident. Extra scrutiny over minor tasks, assignments reassigned without explanation, and meetings where his contributions were downplayed, all leading to an unshakable feeling that something wasn't right. Still, he pushed forward, determined not to let the negativity affect his work. After all, he believed that hard work and perseverance always paid off. Then, one Friday afternoon, as the clock ticked closer to the weekend, everything changed. The office was quiet as everyone focused on wrapping up their tasks, but the silence was broken by the dreaded email notification, "Please see me in my office." Those words from his boss sent a chill down his spine. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and walked across the floor, feeling the eyes of his coworkers subtly following him. Inside the office, the conversation started professionally enough, but it quickly took a turn. His boss, in a calm but unmistakably final tone, announced that his position was being terminated. The reasons were vague, couched in phrases like "not a good fit" and "organizational restructuring." He listened in stunned silence as his boss avoided eye contact, his voice devoid of empathy. The decision felt cold, calculated, and deeply unfair. He had been fired just like that. No acknowledgement of his contributions, no appreciation for the countless hours he had poured into the company. The sting of betrayal hit hard, but more than that, it was the sense of injustice that burned the most. How could this happen? Why him? As he left the office, clutching a box of his belongings, the whispers and sympathetic glances from his colleagues felt like salt on an open wound. But what his boss didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that this wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was just the beginning. Life has a way of balancing the scales, and sometimes, the most unexpected moments spark a chain of events that no one sees coming. That Friday marked the start of a journey that would reveal truths, challenge power, and bring about a reckoning that would shake the very foundation of the office. As he walked out the door for the last time, a plan was already forming in his mind. He didn't know exactly how yet, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let this injustice define him. The stage was set for a story of resilience, justice, and unexpected twists that no one, not even his boss, could have foreseen. As the elevator doors closed behind him, the hum of the office faded, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to echo his thoughts. The street outside was alive with the usual rhythm of the city honking cars, chatter from sidewalk cafes, and the hurried footsteps of people rushing to their next destination. He stood still, clutching the box tightly, feeling like an outsider in a world that kept moving while his own had been abruptly paused. He replayed the meeting in his mind. Every word, every dismissive gesture from his boss seemed sharper now, cutting deeper the more he thought about it. It wasn't just the loss of a job, it was the way it was done. He had worked hard, gone above and beyond, and yet none of it seemed to matter. As he walked to his car, the weight of his belongings felt lighter than the questions now filling his mind. Was this personal? Was there something he missed? Or was it just the unfair nature of how power is wielded in places like that? Sitting in the driver's seat, he didn't start the car right away. Instead, he stared at the dashboard, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with challenges, but this one felt different. It felt deliberate. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. There were a few unread ones from coworkers, brief notes expressing surprise and disappointment at what had just happened. One, in particular, stood out: a simple, "Call me when you can," from a colleague he had always trusted. Later that evening, as he sat in his small but cozy apartment, he decided to make that call. The voice on the other end was hesitant but filled with concern. "I don't know all the details," the colleague began, "but things haven't been adding up lately. There's been talk, whispers about changes coming from the top. It feels like they've been looking for an excuse." "An excuse?" he repeated, the words sinking in like a stone. "Yes," the voice replied, quieter now as if someone might overhear. "I've seen it before. You challenge the wrong people, or maybe they feel threatened, and suddenly you're out. But this time, it doesn't feel clean. It feels off." The conversation left him with more questions than answers. If there was something bigger at play, he needed to know. Not because he wanted revenge, though the thought did cross his mind, but because he deserved the truth. He had given his best to that job, and if there was more to the story, he wasn't going to let it slip away unnoticed. Over the next few days, he started piecing things together. Quietly, methodically, he reached out to a few more colleagues, those he trusted to be honest. Their stories painted a picture that was both troubling and revealing. There had been odd decisions lately, good people being let go, questionable hires filling their places, and projects shifting direction without explanation. It seemed like a pattern, and one that didn't make much sense unless you dug deeper. But it wasn't until one conversation with an old friend, a lawyer who had a knack for uncovering hidden truths, that things started to click. His friend listened carefully, asking questions, and by the end of the call, they had a theory. "You might be dealing with something bigger than office politics," the lawyer said. "If you're willing, we can look into this. But it'll take patience and persistence." He didn't hesitate. If there was a chance to uncover the truth, he was all in. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone who had been affected, who had worked hard only to be cast aside without cause. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. Weeks passed, and the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together. There were documents, emails, and whispers of conversations that hinted at something unethical, possibly illegal, happening behind the scenes. It was risky digging into it, but every discovery only fueled his resolve. He was careful, though. He knew that one wrong move could tip them off, and then the trail would go cold. Through it all, he kept a low profile, spending his days applying for new jobs and his nights poring over the details of what he and his friend had uncovered. There were moments of doubt, times when the frustration of not having all the answers felt overwhelming. But then he remembered the way his boss had looked at him that day, so detached and certain that there would be no consequences, and it would ignite a spark in him to keep going. Meanwhile, back at the office, things were shifting. Whispers of his quiet investigation began to reach certain ears, and the tension in the air grew thicker. People started watching their words, their actions, as if they knew something was coming but couldn't figure out what or from where. And his boss, the man who had so callously let him go, was beginning to feel the weight of something he couldn't quite name. The stage was set for a confrontation, but how it would play out was still unclear. Every move he made was deliberate, every piece of evidence carefully gathered and stored. He didn't want to jump the gun, he wanted to make sure that when the truth came to light, it would be undeniable. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of unease grew. For everyone involved, it felt like the calm before a storm that no one, not even his boss, could see coming. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. He juggled his quiet investigation with trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in his personal life. The truth was, he hadn't told many people what he was doing, not even his closest friends or family. He knew the risk of speaking too soon. If this backfired, he'd not only lose the chance to expose what was happening but might also jeopardize his own reputation. So, he stayed quiet, choosing his words carefully when anyone asked how he was doing. But inside, the fire was building. Every new detail his friend helped uncover pointed to something far more deliberate than simple mismanagement. contracts awarded to outside firms under suspicious circumstances, internal policies bent to favor certain individuals, and even emails that hinted at efforts to silence dissenting voices. It was no wonder his boss had let him go. He wasn't just a target of convenience, he was a potential threat to the entire operation. Meanwhile, the tension back at the office continued to grow. Employees who had once been confident in their roles now felt a lingering uncertainty. People whispered in hallways and glanced over their shoulders during meetings, sensing something they couldn't quite put their finger on. There were rumors, always rumors, but no one could say for sure what was happening. Some speculated about budget cuts, others about a merger or acquisition, but a few started to wonder if firings were about more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. Among those quietly paying attention was a colleague who had been there longer than most. She had seen the company go through its ups and downs and had a knack for reading between the lines. When she noticed patterns in the way certain employees were being treated, she began digging into it herself. What she found didn't sit right with her files that had been deleted from shared servers, meeting minutes that seemed deliberately vague, and conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked into the room. One evening, she decided to reach out. She hadn't spoken to him since he'd been let go, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he might have noticed the same things she had. When he picked up the phone, her voice was hesitant but steady. "I don't know how to say this," she began, "but something is going on here. And I think you might have been caught in the middle of it." They talked for hours that night, comparing notes and filling in gaps in each other's understanding of what was happening. For the first time since it had all begun, he felt like he wasn't alone in this. Her insights gave him a clearer picture of just how deep the problem went, and how many people might be involved. But with that clarity came a new layer of complication. If the corruption or whatever this was ran as deep as it seemed, exposing it wouldn't be simple. There were layers of protection built into the system, people who would likely go to great lengths to keep their secrets buried. And then there was the personal risk. Speaking out could mean burning bridges, facing retaliation, or worse. Despite the danger, he and his former colleague decided to keep digging, now working together to piece together the puzzle. They shared files, compared timelines, and began building a case. Each discovery felt like a small victory, but it also raised more questions. Why had these particular employees been targeted? Who stood to gain from their removal? And how far were the people behind this willing to go to protect themselves? At the same time, he couldn't ignore the impact this was having on his own life. The job applications he sent out went unanswered more often than not, and the weight of uncertainty began to take its toll. Some days he wondered if he should just let it go, move on, and focus on rebuilding his career elsewhere. But every time that thought crossed his mind, he'd remember the look in his boss's eyes during their last meeting, cold, dismissive, and so sure that there would be no consequences. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people still working there, the ones too afraid to speak up. It was about standing up to the kind of power that thought it could get away with anything. And it was about proving, to himself and to everyone else, that the truth mattered. As the weeks went on, the pressure mounted. The closer they got to uncovering the full scope of what was happening, the more the risks increased. There were strange moments, files disappearing from their shared folder, a missed call from an unknown number that left no voicemail, and a car parked outside his apartment late one night that seemed to leave as soon as he noticed it. He couldn't prove any of it was connected, but the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. Despite the fear, he pressed on. His former colleague, now just as invested as he was, encouraged him to stay the course. Together, they planned their next steps carefully, knowing that one wrong move could undo everything they'd worked for. The story was building, the pieces falling into place, but the full picture was still just out of reach. What they didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that someone else was watching, too. Someone on the inside who had been quietly following the trail they were leaving, piecing together their own version of events. And while they hadn't made their presence known yet, It was only a matter of time before all their paths would collide in a way that none of them could have predicted. The air felt heavier now, each day bringing a sense of urgency that neither he nor his former colleague could ignore. Their investigation had reached a point where the stakes were unmistakably high. They had unearthed enough to suggest that this wasn't just a case of workplace politics or poor management. It was deliberate, calculated, and rooted in something much bigger than they had initially imagined. As the evidence piled up, so did the risks. There were nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they'd gone too far. The strange occurrences hadn't stopped either. Emails from trusted sources suddenly bounced back, his laptop froze unexpectedly during critical moments, and there was the lingering sense that someone was watching, waiting. But none of it deterred him. If anything, it solidified his resolve. The turning point came one evening when his former colleague called, her voice urgent. "I think I've found something," she said, her tone a mix of excitement and apprehension. "You need to see this." They met at a small CAF, choosing a corner table where they could talk without being overheard. She slid a folder across the table, her hand shaking slightly. Inside were copies of documents, contracts, internal memos, and financial records that painted a damning picture. There was clear evidence of favoritism, shady financial dealings, and a coordinated effort to remove employees who might question the status quo. But there was more. Among the documents was an email thread between his former boss and an outside consultant. The tone of the messages was smug, almost taunting, as they discussed how easy it had been to remove problematic employees. His name was mentioned directly, a chilling confirmation that his firing had been part of a larger plan. For a moment, he couldn't speak. The words blurred together as anger, hurt, and determination surged through him. "They knew exactly what they were doing," he said finally, his voice low but steady. She nodded. "And they thought no one would ever connect the dots." Their next step was clear. They needed to take this to someone who could do something about it. But who? The legal system? The media? Both options felt daunting, especially given the power and resources of the people they were up against. As they debated their options, the CAF door opened, and someone walked in, someone familiar. It was a current employee from the company, someone neither of them had spoken to in months. He spotted them almost immediately, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, the three of them just stared at each other, the tension palpable. Then, slowly, he approached their table. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. They exchanged a glance before nodding. "Go ahead," she said, motioning for him to sit. He hesitated, glancing around the CAF as if to make sure no one else was listening. Then, leaning in, he said, "I know what you're doing. And you're right about all of it. But there's something you don't know." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. He looked over his shoulder again before continuing. "They're watching you. Both of you. And they're already taking steps to cover their tracks." The gravity of his words hit them like a wave. They had known the risks, but hearing it confirmed by someone on the inside made it all the more real. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked, his voice wary. "Because I've seen what they do to people who get in their way," the employee replied. "And I don't want that to happen to you. Or to me, for that matter. But there's something else, something bigger. I think you've only scratched the surface." The suspense was almost unbearable now. Every word he spoke felt like another step closer to a truth they weren't sure they were ready to face. And yet, they couldn't turn back. "What do you mean, something bigger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated again, his gaze shifting between them. "I can't explain here. Not now. But if you're serious about this, meet me tomorrow night. Same time, different place. I'll bring what I have." Without waiting for a response, he stood and left, leaving them with more questions than answers. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. "He's scared," she said finally. "And if he's scared, that means we're closer than we think." Closer to what, though? That was the question that lingered as they parted ways that evening. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something monumental, something that would change everything not just for them but for everyone involved. The next day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. When night fell, they met again, this time in a quiet park away from prying eyes. The employee was already there, pacing nervously. When he saw them, he stopped and held up a flash drive. "This," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "is everything. The emails, the transactions, the names. But once you see it, there's no going back." They exchanged a glance, their resolve unspoken but mutual. "We're ready," he said. But as the employee handed over the drive, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They turned, their hearts racing, to see a figure emerging from the shadows. "Going somewhere?" the voice said, cold and sharp. And in that moment, they knew this was the point of no return. The figure stepped closer, their presence commanding and unnervingly calm. The faint light caught the edge of their face, enough to reveal a smirk that sent chills through everyone present. It was someone they recognized, not the boss, but someone close enough to them to wield authority. The employee visibly stiffened, his hand instinctively retracting the flash drive he had just handed over. "You think this ends well for you?" the figure said, their tone heavy with mockery. "You have no idea what you're up against." The tension crackled like electricity. No one spoke for a moment, but the silence was deafening. Finally, the former employee who had initiated the entire investigation stepped forward, his voice steady but simmering with restrained anger. "We know enough to bring the truth out. And there's nothing you can say or do to stop us." The figure let out a low chuckle, shaking their head. "You really think you're the first ones to try this? That you're special?" Their eyes darted to the employee who had handed over the flash drive. "And you? Do you think your little act of rebellion is going unnoticed? You should have stayed quiet, like everyone else." The employee flinched but didn't back down. Quiet isn't an option anymore. Not when people's lives are being destroyed. The figure's smirk faded, replaced with a cold stare that felt more threatening than any words could convey. "Fine," they said at last, stepping back slightly. "If you want to play this game, go ahead. But don't say I didn't warn you." As they disappeared into the shadows, the group was left shaken, their resolve tested but not broken. The former employee clutched the flash drive tightly, their determination growing with each passing second. "We have to move fast," he said. "They know we're onto them now, and they're going to do everything they can to stop us." They quickly decided to split up, agreeing that the drive needed to be copied and analyzed immediately. The employee who had provided the flash drive offered to take it back with him, claiming he had the tools to safely extract and review the data without detection. Reluctantly, they agreed, knowing time was of the essence. But as he walked away, a strange unease settled over them. Something about the figure's appearance felt orchestrated, as if it was meant to sow doubt and fear. Was the drive really safe? Could they trust anyone at this point? The questions lingered, gnawing at the edges of their confidence. Later that night, he sat in his apartment, staring at his computer screen as he reviewed the latest documents they had uncovered. Every new piece of information painted a darker picture of the company's inner workings. It wasn't just about firing employees unfairly, there was evidence of systemic manipulation, targeting individuals who posed a threat to their agenda. But something else stood out, buried deep in the files, encrypted messages referencing a contingency plan. The term appeared repeatedly, always vague and without context, but it was clear it held significant weight. He tried to decode the files, but the encryption was beyond his expertise. Frustrated, he realized they needed someone with specialized skills, someone who could crack the codes and uncover the full truth. Just as he was about to call his former colleague, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. Be careful who you trust. The flash drive is a trap. His heart raced. Was it a bluff? A scare tactic? Or had they made a grave mistake? He quickly called his former colleague, relaying the message and urging her to meet him immediately. They needed to regroup, reassess, and figure out their next move. When they met, she looked as shaken as he felt. I've been getting strange calls all night, she admitted. Blocked numbers, no one speaking on the other end. And I'm starting to think we've underestimated how far they'll go to protect themselves. Before they could process the implications, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from the employee who had taken the flash drive. He answered quickly, his voice laced with urgency. Did you find anything? There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice that sounded eerily calm. You should come see for yourself, the employee said. But hurry. I don't know how much time we have. The cryptic response only heightened their anxiety, but they didn't hesitate. They drove to the employee's location, a small office space he had rented for privacy. When they arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The employee looked pale, his eyes darting nervously as he ushered them inside. I decrypted part of the drive, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And it's worse than we thought. He pulled up a series of files on his computer, each one more damning than the last. There were records of payouts, surveillance logs, and correspondence that hinted at blackmail. But what stood out most were the references to the contingency plan, now revealed to be a list of individuals targeted for removal, complete with personal details and chilling annotations. Their names were on the list. The room fell silent as the weight of the discovery sank in. They weren't just exposing corruption, they were directly in the crosshairs of a system designed to eliminate dissent. What do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed outside the office door. The footsteps grew louder, each thud reverberating in their chests. Panic gripped the group as they exchanged frantic glances, searching for an escape route. The employee who had decrypted the files quickly shut down his computer, removing the flash drive and slipping it into his pocket. Stay quiet, he whispered, motioning for them to move to the far corner of the room. The door handle jiggled, then stopped. A long silence followed, amplifying the tension. Just when they thought the intruder might have left, the door burst open. A figure stepped inside, their silhouette backlit by the dim hallway light. It wasn't who they expected. Standing there was someone they thought they could trust, an ally who had supported their fight from the beginning. But the expression on their face was cold, almost unrecognizable. The figure closed the door behind them, locking it with a deliberate click. I warned you, they said, their voice carrying an edge of regret. You should have let this go. The betrayal hit them like a blow. You, the former employee said, his voice cracking with disbelief. Why? After everything we've been through? The figure sighed, stepping closer. You don't understand what you're up against. This isn't just about a corrupt boss or a few shady deals. It's bigger than all of us. And if you keep pushing, you'll end up like the others. The group tensed, their fear mingling with anger. We're not backing down, the former employee said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. People deserve to know the truth, no matter how dangerous it is. The figure shook their head. You're brave, but you're naive. They've already seen to it that you're implicated. Those files? They're bait, carefully planted to make it look like you're part of the corruption. By the time you try to explain yourself, it'll be too late. The words sent a chill through the group, but something didn't add up. Why are you telling us this? The woman asked, her eyes narrowing. If you're on their side, why warn us at all? For a moment, the figure hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, they reached into their pocket and pulled out a second flash drive. Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't give you a fighting chance. This drive has the real evidence, the kind they've been hiding even from me. If you use it right, you can expose everything. The group stared at the drive, their emotions a mix of suspicion and hope. Why would you risk this? The former employee asked. The figure's face softened, their earlier coldness giving way to something more human. Because I've seen what they're capable of, and I can't be a part of it anymore. But you have to hurry. Once they realize what I've done, none of us will be safe. Before anyone could respond, the sound of more footsteps echoed down the hallway, this time louder and more purposeful. The figure's eyes widened. Go, they urged, shoving the flash drive into the former employee's hand. There's a back exit through the storage room. Don't stop until you're far away from here. Without wasting a second, the group bolted for the exit, their hearts pounding as they navigated the narrow, dimly lit corridors. Behind them, the sound of voices and heavy boots grew louder, signaling the arrival of the real threat. They emerged into the cool night air, gasping for breath but refusing to stop. With the second flash drive in their possession, they knew they held the key to dismantling the corruption once and for all. But the stakes were higher than ever, and the betrayal they had just faced left them questioning everyone around them. As they reached a safe distance, the woman finally spoke, her voice filled with determination. We can't let their fear win. We have to finish this. The former employee nodded, his grip tightening around the flash drive. We will. No matter what it takes. But as they turned to leave, a car parked across the street flashed its headlights, its engine revving ominously. A figure inside the car rolled down the window, their face obscured but their intent clear. It wasn't over. Not yet. And the group realized that the real fight was just beginning. The engine of the car idled ominously, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The group froze, their breaths shallow, hearts pounding in unison. The driver's silhouette was barely visible, but their intent loomed like a shadow over the fragile sense of hope the team had carried away from the building. The woman glanced at the others, her mind racing. They couldn't run anymore, not without knowing who was behind that wheel. The former employee, still clutching the second flash drive, stepped forward cautiously, his face set with determination. We don't have time for games, he said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. If you're here to stop us, you'll have to do more than just intimidate us. The car door opened, and a figure emerged. For a fleeting moment, their identity remained obscured, until they stepped under the streetlight. It was the ally who had betrayed them earlier, but their expression was different now, softer, almost apologetic. I couldn't let you go without explaining everything, the ally said, raising their hands as if to signal they meant no harm. I've risked everything to give you that drive. But there's something you need to know before you use it. The group exchanged wary glances but didn't lower their guard. We're done playing these games, the woman said firmly. If you're trying to stall us, it won't work. The allies shook their head. No, you don't understand. That drive. It's not just evidence. It's also a target. The moment you try to upload or share it, they'll know exactly where you are. It's bait and a trap all in one. The weight of those words hung heavily in the air. The group had come so far, risked so much, and yet every step forward seemed to push them closer to danger. Then what are we supposed to do? The former employee asked, his frustration breaking through. We can't just let them get away with this. There's a way, the ally said quietly. But it won't be easy. You'll need to go public, not just online, but in person, where they can't manipulate the narrative. You'll need to speak out, together, and present everything you've found. The press, the public, they're your best defense now. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy with the weight of its implications. Going public would mean putting their faces and names on the line, exposing themselves to scrutiny and retaliation. But it would also mean finally taking control of the narrative, refusing to be silenced by fear. The woman stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. If that's what it takes, then we'll do it. We didn't come this far to hide in the shadows. The group nodded in agreement, their resolve hardening. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and they had the truth. That had to be enough. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, contacting trusted journalists, preparing their evidence, and rehearsing their testimony. The ally, despite their earlier betrayal, stayed by their side, providing critical insights into the organization's tactics and weaknesses. Slowly, the plan came together, and the pieces began to fall into place. When the day of the press conference arrived, the group stood on a small stage in a crowded park, surrounded by cameras, microphones, and a growing audience. The former employee stepped up to the podium first, his hands shaking but his voice steady as he began to speak. "We're here today because the truth matters," he said, his words carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "For too long, corruption and greed have been allowed to flourish unchecked. But we refuse to stay silent any longer." As each member of the group took their turn, the story unfolded in vivid detail: the wrongful termination, the hidden files, the dangerous threats, and the unwavering determination to expose the truth. By the time they presented the evidence from the second flash drive, the crowd was riveted, their disbelief giving way to outrage and support. The press conference made headlines almost immediately, sparking a wave of public outcry and forcing authorities to take action. Investigations were launched, arrests were made, and the corrupt organization's grip on power began to crumble. The group, though still wary of retaliation, found strength in the overwhelming support they received from the public and from each other. Months later, as the dust began to settle, the former employee sat in a quiet coffee shop, reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey had been harrowing, filled with twists and turns they never could have anticipated. But in the end, they had achieved what they set out to do: shine a light on the darkness and hold those in power accountable. The door to the coffee shop opened, and the woman entered, a warm smile on her face. "You ready?" she asked, sitting across from him. He nodded, a sense of calm washing over him. "Yeah. I think I finally am." As they walked out together, the city around them seemed brighter, more alive. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain: when ordinary people come together to stand up for what's right, they can accomplish extraordinary things. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for.